A record spins and the room remembers. Light pools on the Studio B floorboards, warm as kitchen lamps after supper, and 100 small hopes breathe in at once. The camera glides, shoes whisper, a trumpet line finds its courage. He's there at the edge of the frame, Frank Spagnuola, tilting his weight forward, testing the give of the wood like a swimmer tasting water. He doesn't flare for attention. He calibrates, partner's hand, band's pulse, the hush that falls just before the beat arrives. Then movement, tidy, musical, kind. The lens adores neatness, and Frank gives it lines you can trust. In 1957, when Bandstand outgrew Philadelphia and spoke to the nation, Frank's steadiness became a signature. With Dottie Horner, he carried the room through a smiling storm, Calypso champions to the final chord, and before the glow cooled, returned to the floor for a faster gamble, finishing runner-up in the Jitterbug against the evening's darlings. Not the loudest, not the tallest, just the dancer who made rhythm feel like home. If you were there, you remember the feeling. The song found its center, and so did you, because he did first. Before the nation ever tuned in, Philadelphia taught its own kind of timing. Trolleys chimed on Market Street, lunch counters clicked shut at 3, and radios bled guitar across rowhouse bricks. In that clockwork, Frank learned to keep time the practical way, counting cracks in the sidewalk to 4, matching footfalls to the backbeat, finding the pocket where a song stops being noise and becomes a place to stand. After school, he'd chase the signal that poured from WFIL, call letters like a secret handshake, and imagine the studio not as a building, but as a room that could carry his weight. Studio B was smaller than memory allows and larger than life requires. Lights hung low like curious moons, cables slept along the baseboards, and a red tally lamp could make a heartbeat feel audible. Regulars arranged themselves into a living metronome, pairs turning like teeth on a gear, a rotation learned by muscle and courtesy. You stood where the floor captain told you. You kept your frame clean so the camera could read your intent. When the cue card tilted, smile. When the bandleader lifted a finger, breathe. Before Dick Clark, Bob Horn's committee set the temperature. There were rules written and rules inherited. Mind the door, dress like you're visiting a grandmother who loves records, keep the swing joyful but never sloppy. Frank wasn't built for grandstanding, he was built for generosity. He centered his partner first, steady hand at the back, a clear signal through the fingertips, then trimmed his own movement until it read, as music, not ego. In Jitterbug, he let 6 counts feel like a sentence that lands soft on the period. In Swing, he kept his knees conversational so the floor gave back instead of arguing. When a tune broke to silence, he could hold the shape of a final phrase a half-second longer than fear. And that half-second is where television falls in love. Technique was his way of saying please and thank you. He kept his axis quiet so turns didn't chatter. He placed his feet like punctuation, letting the melody talk. Even his mistakes, because everyone stumbles, arrived with good manners. A micro-adjustment, a breath, a smile that told his partner, "We're fine." The room trusted him for that. Cameras did too. And the city, heat rising off its brick and asphalt, began to dream outward. In 1957, Bandstand would leave the neighborhood and speak in a bigger voice. The lights would sharpen, the stakes would climb. But the grammar of the dance and count, connect, commit was already written in Frank's body. When the show widened to meet America, he didn't have to change who he was. He only had to step to the mark, lift his eyes to the lens, and let the country see what Philadelphia had been hearing all along. The year didn't arrive all at once. It gathered, like thunder you feel in window glass before you hear it, until Philadelphia woke to find its neighborhood dance floor speaking in a national register. The cameras were the same, more or less. The room hadn't grown. But the red tally light now meant Idaho and Florida and a living room in Kansas where a father might pause with his tie half knotted and wonder how his house had learned a new kind of heartbeat. In 1957, Bandstand widened its mouth and the country leaned closer to listen. For the regulars, expansion didn't change the ritual so much as it heightened the stakes. Hair had to hold, shoes had to behave, smiles needed to read across the invisible distance between a studio and a stranger's couch. Frank felt that voltage, but didn't let it rewrite him. If anything, it refined him. He trimmed flourishes to the measure of the lens, the way you lower your voice in a chapel so the whisper can travel farther. Partners noticed first, then the floor captains. Then the camera that loves reliability the way a tightrope loves a steady foot. A new mood took the air, brighter, faster, a touch of ceremony. The playlists sharpened, the band tucked in. Dick Clark's cadence made even the silences feel well pressed. Around Frank, the constellation of faces formed. Justin with her clarity, Clayton with his wire-taut timing, Dottie with a smile that could set tempo by itself. You could feel the room iterating toward something like a grammar. If the song says turn, you turn. If the phrase says wait, you let the floor breathe. The dance wasn't just steps now. It was a language with an audience. And then the announcements that made a weekday feel like an opening night. Contests. Chalypso first. A hybrid wave rolling in from a dozen jukeboxes and one chart-topping record. Jitterbug later. Faster waters, stronger current. The sign-up sheets filled with careful handwriting, as if the names themselves were practicing posture. Partners met quieter than usual, plotting in the corners, counting under their breath, testing how a break would land if the crowd exhaled at the same second. Frank and Dottie didn't change their formula. They polished it. Count, connect, commit. She trusted his lead. He trusted her light. On rehearsal days, the studio wore its nervousness like cologne. Sound checks stretched, shoes tapped in patterns that meant nothing and everything. Some dancers chased daring, bigger tricks, higher air. Frank chased tone. Could a line be straighter? Could a turn end like the period on a love letter? He wasn't hunting seconds. He was hunting inevitability, that feeling when a movement happens because the music left it no choice. When the week of the first contest finally stood in the doorway, the floorboards seemed to know. They gave back a little more. The lights warmed a shade, and somewhere in the hush before the cue, Frank let his breath fall into Dottie's, the count settling between them like a promise. The country was watching. The song was waiting. All that remained was to step into the beat and make the room believe. They called it a fad at first, Chalypso, a pop daydream that borrowed a little sun from faraway islands and poured it into a neat American glass. But on contest night, when Little Darlin' caught the studio like static, it felt less like fashion and more like weather. The intro doo-wop stacked like steps. The handclap stitched a runway down the middle of the floor. The camera shifted, hungry. Frank lifted his frame. Dottie Horner found his hand, and the room learned what it means when two people agree on a heartbeat. Calypso doesn't shout. It smiles. The hips speak in half sentences, the feet edit. Frank trimmed everything to essentials, shoulders relaxed, elbows quiet, wrists soft as ribbon. He counted through Dottie's breath, not over it, feeding her space the way good partners pour light onto a face. Their brakes landed on the sweet edge of the backbeat, then floated a fraction, just long enough for the melody to admire itself, before the next step gathered them forward. When the chorus hit, their turns wrote cursive into the air. Open, travel, close. Clean entries, cleaner exits. You could see the floor captains nod without meaning to. What the lens loved was intention. Frank placed weight like a craftsman setting tile. No gaps, no rush. And Dottie answered with a clarity that made timing look like kindness. They used the room without hogging it. Diagonals that read on television. Resets that kept them visible. A final figure that faced the band as if to say, "Thank you for the map." The audience felt seen by that. Even at home, 1,000 living rooms nodded along. Not sure why they trusted these two, but certain they did. There were bolder pairs on other nights, flashier wrists, tricks that courted the gasp. But Calypso, done right, favors restraint. It asks for swing without swagger, flirtation without noise. Frank and Dottie understood the ask. Their lines were tidy because they were generous. They let the song keep its dignity. They let each other keep theirs. The cut to the judges felt longer than it was. You could hear the stage crew breathing. Dick Clark's voice smoothed the air, and then the announcement fell with a soft clatter of applause, turning into cheers. Winners, Frank Spagnuola and Dottie Horner. The prize, a portable television, sounded almost comically perfect, as if the show were handing them a smaller version of itself to take home. Frank laughed, a little surprised at his own relief. Dottie squeezed his fingers, a quick pulse of "we did it" that would replay in memory with the same fidelity as the record. Afterward, in the ordinary brightness of backstage, the magic refused to dissolve. The band packed up. Someone folded a cue card in half and slid it into a pocket. Frank checked his shoes for dust, an old habit. Dottie tucked a loose strand of hair and grinned like a secret. On the way out, the studio door sighed and the hallway smelled like fresh paint. Philadelphia waited. So did the next tempo. But for one night, the center of the country felt no farther than the space between two hands that had counted the same song and found it good. If Calypso was a smile, Jitterbug was a dare. The room tightened, as if the lights had been ratcheted one click brighter. Chuck Berry's rock and roll music came on like a fuse, and every heartbeat in Studio B borrowed its tempo. The floor widened, funny how music can do that, and then narrowed again to the handful of couples who could make velocity look like grace. Frank reset his grip with Dottie Horner, eyes soft, frame alive. This time, there would be no floating. This time you ride the downbeat or you fall. Jitterbug isn't only faster, it's less forgiving. Footwork must be crisp enough to read from a moving camera, but loose enough to rebound. Swing-outs need to travel without fraying. Breaks must trust the room's exact echo. Frank trimmed his lines to the speed limit and then found a way to make that limit look generous. 6 counts became sentences with clean punctuation: lead, open, breathe, return, while Dottie answered in a tone that never cracked. When he spun her, his hand was a hinge, not a hook. When she spun herself, he cleared the lane as if courtesy were part of the choreography. Around them, the night's darlings, Justine Corelli and Bill, Bob Clayton, moved like wire drawn through air. Taut, brilliant, inevitable. The lens loved them for the reasons it always had: amplitude with control, a stage sense that could find the center of the room by instinct alone. They would take the laurels in the jukebox with 200 records, a prize so gloriously on the nose that even the floor crew grinned. Frank knew the math of it before the final chord. He also knew math isn't the same as meaning. What he hunted, what they both hunted, was tone at speed. On the turnarounds, Frank and Dottie shaved milliseconds without eating the beat. On the breakaways, they showed the audience what air could look like if you trusted each other. There's a kind of bravery that never raises its voice. It looks like a controlled center under pressure, a partner's hand found without searching, a smile that survives the G-forces of tempo. The applause landed like warm rain. Runner-up. You could see the word on Dottie's lips, there and gone, and then the way her fingers folded into Frank's said it better. Achievement is a horizon, not a door. The room agreed. Some nights, victory wears a crown. Some nights it wears a steadiness you can take home and use. Backstage, with the adrenaline still bright in his blood, Frank tested the scuffed edge of a heel, the way a mechanic listens to an engine cooling after a good run. He felt strangely light. Second place isn't second best when you've learned how to breathe at full speed. On the walk out, the corridor carried a ghost of the band. It sounded like tomorrow tapping its foot. Partnership on Studio B was never a contract. It was a conversation written in shoe leather and breath. With Dottie Horner, Frank learned the grammar of that talk, how a fingertip can mean wait, how a shoulder angle can mean now, how a shared inhale can turn a floor into a map. She was bright where he was calm, precise where he was patient, and between them the music found a tone that felt both tidy and generous. Rehearsal wasn't endless hours in a mirrored room. It was 100 little checks folded into ordinary days, counting silently in line at the corner deli, tracing steps on the walk home, testing a turn in the hallway while a jacket still hung on one shoulder. By the time the red light blinked, the steps had worn themselves into muscle like a good habit. There were other orbits, too. Charlotte Russo, stepped into the picture like a new verse to a familiar song. 6 months of dating and dancing that taught Frank how chemistry can redirect the same choreography. Charlotte moved with a fresher edge, a forward tilt that asked the phrase a question before answering it. With her, Frank learned to signal sooner, to leave a hair more room on exits, to find the smile mid-spin instead of at the end. The floor noticed. So did the small society that grew around the show. Barbara Marson and the other regulars, floor captains with folded clipboards, camera ops who could tell you which couples breathed together by the way their frames settled after a break. Etiquette carried the room. You dressed as though a grandmother who loved records might be watching, which everywhere in America one probably was. You kept your shoes quiet when the mic was live. You said thank you to a partner with a gentle return to center after the last beat. The lead follow wasn't rank. It was courtesy, the promise that someone would hold the door while the other passed through. Frank believed in that promise. He built his dancing around it. If the floor was crowded, he steered the traffic with invisible hands. If an elbow flared in the wrong place, he absorbed the shock and smoothed the line before the lens could see the ripple. And then there was the off-camera weave. Soda fountains, corner stoops, bus rides threaded with laughter that made the city feel smaller, fan letters found their way into jacket pockets, a snapshot traded hands and became an heirloom by accident. The friendships were as durable as the steps, partly because they were made under the same heat, the stopwatch of television, the polite tyranny of the tally lamp, the knowledge that a nation had learned your names and might forget them in a month. You learned to protect each other from that. A nod before the music, a squeeze of fingers after, a promise, spoken or not, that whatever the room demanded, you'd answer it together. In those constellations, Frank learned the quiet geometry of trust, 2 points, 1 line, drawn again and again until it becomes a path. Television ends quickly. The music fades, the credits roll, and tomorrow wants you on time. Frank learned that lesson without bitterness. He folded his jackets with the same care he gave to exits on a turn, shook hands with the floor captains who had shepherded 100 small miracles, and stepped into a city that still kept time but no longer pointed cameras at his feet. Work waited, the kind with measurements and margins, tape pulled taut over wood, a pencil parked behind the ear. Design suited him. It asked for proportion, patience, and the kind of seeing that starts with listening. He had been practicing that all along. In quiet rooms, he drew rectangles into shelter, scaled light to human need, placed a chair so conversation could find it without effort. He thought about flow as if it were choreography, where the eye traveled first, how space welcomed a body, where a doorway should let a person breathe before asking them to choose left or right. Clients liked that. They might not have known the word for it, but they recognized grace when the door swung easily and a window caught the late hour at just the right angle. Some afternoons, measuring tape in hand, he'd notice how the floor talked back through his shoes and smile at the old reflex, count, connect, commit, now translated into walls and grain. Life took its turns. A marriage marked by ordinary holidays and photographs that didn't need captions, children sprinting through hallways he had drawn on paper before they were rooms. Later, the soft astonishment of grandchildren who learned that the quiet man who built forts from couch cushions once danced on national television. They would ask, "Was it loud?" He'd say, "Loud enough to hear your heart." "Did you win?" "Sometimes." What did it feel like? Like knowing where to put your feet when the world asks a hard question. The past kept visiting without demanding to move back in. A letter from a viewer found its way a decade late. An old 45 turned up at a yard sale. Every so often, someone would recognize his name and tell a story that was really about themselves. A Friday afternoon when the living room felt larger. A cousin who copied steps and scuffed a rug to threads. He understood. Nostalgia isn't a mirror. It's a window you clean together. If he signed a program or posed for a photo at a reunion, he did it the way he danced, tidily, without haste, with room for the other person to stand comfortably inside the moment. On certain evenings, after the dishes, before the news, he'd let a record roll and test the give of the kitchen floor, a private audit of balance and memory. The turns were smaller now, the frame a touch closer, but the count had not changed. Music asks for the same courtesies no matter the decade. Arrive, attend, answer. When the song ended, he'd hold the last shape a heartbeat longer than habit, as if to prove the silence wasn't empty. Then lights out, pencils sharpened for morning, and the old echo sleeping in the boards like a promise kept. The first time he walked into a Meet the Regulars afternoon, the air knew him before the crowd did. Church hall light through frosted windows, folding chairs set in polite rows, a microphone leaning forward like an old friend. On the flyers, his name sat beside others, Arlene, Charlotte, familiar constellations reordered by time. And yet the room behaved exactly like Studio B used to. A hush, a lift of faces, the soft tremor of anticipation when someone mentions a song by name. Memory has its own stagecraft. He didn't arrive with anecdotes sharpened for applause. He arrived with the same economy he brought to dance. Begin on the count, leave space for your partner. A question from the back. What did it feel like when the red light came on? and he smiled the way you do when a word returns to your tongue after years away. Like being measured by a heartbeat, he said. Like learning that steadiness is a kind of love. Laughter in the right places, a few quiet exhalations in the others. An elderly couple in the third row held hands the entire time. Afterward, they told him Fridays had been their standing date because of Bandstand. He wrote their names down, as if names were steps worth keeping. At Cape May, posters curled gently at the edges in salt air, while fans compared ticket stubs and traded photographs rescued from shoeboxes. He signed with a tidy hand, not carving his name but placing it. People tended to bring the same questions in different coats. Did you know then it was special? Did you meet so-and-so? Do you still dance? He answered honestly. Some nights we did know. Most nights we were just trying to keep time. Yes and yes and yes, though slower now, he'd add. But slower isn't smaller when you still mean it. There were videos, too, the kind that stitch a dozen voices into one long confession of joy. A table microphone catching laughter that sounds like it belongs to a younger room. A camera that tilts as if leaning closer could borrow a little more truth. When asked for advice, he offered the same 3 verbs that had gotten him through tight corners and bright stages. Count, connect, commit. It works for dancing, he'd say, but it also works for conversation, for work, for love. Know where you are in the measure. Make room for the other person. Finish the phrase you started. In Wildwood, beneath a mural the color of jukebox glass, the reunion felt like a neighborhood block party that had learned better lighting. The twist rippled outward on cue. Photographs caught him mid-laugh, shoulders softened, eyes reflecting a shine the ocean gives to everything nearby. He didn't pose as the hero of a story. He stood as a witness to a generation that found itself on waxed floorboards, to the polite revolution of rhythm, to the good manners of a well-led turn. What a reunion really restores isn't the past. It's the way the past taught you to be present. On the drive home, programs slid against the dashboard and the sun made the windshield a bright, unbroken note. He cracked the window, the car filled with the smell of salt and summer. Somewhere under the engine and the road, he caught the faintest backbeat and tapped the wheel, steady as ever. Legends tend to arrive with brass and banners. Frank's didn't. His legacy fits in the palm. 2 dates, 2 dances, and a way of moving that treated music like a promise. 1957 is the year the record keeps. Calypso champions with Dottie Horner. Jitterbug runners-up in a heat bright enough to polish names. But what endures is less a headline than a habit. He made rhythm feel like home. Watch any scrap of film closely and you'll see the argument he quietly won. Flash fades, neatness doesn't. Tricks age, timing ages well. He held the center of a phrase the way a good sentence holds breath, and he gave partners the gift most rare on a crowded floor. Room. That courtesy is its own kind of virtuosity. It says, I am here, you are safe, the music will carry us if we carry it back. There's a reason the camera kept finding him. Television is engineered suspicion. It does not easily trust, but it trusts what lands clean and reads true. Frank understood lenses the way carpenters understand light, where it falls, what it reveals, how to meet it without flinching. He placed his weight like a craftsman sets grain. He finished ideas. He left no ragged edges for the frame to catch. That is a craft worth teaching, whether to dancers, designers, or grandchildren trying to stand where the beat asks. If you listen to the way people remember him, you hear the same music. Steadiness, kindness, exactness without sharpness. The portable television he won is a tidy metaphor, but the real prize was smaller and more transferable. The sentence he carried forward into work and family, and those reunions where the air still knew him. Count, connect, commit, know your measure, make room, finish what you start. It is choreography and it is ethics, both at once. American Bandstand was many things. A marketplace of songs, a mirror for a country inventing adolescence on live TV, a weekly test of poise under merciless lighting. But it was also a school for ordinary grace. In that curriculum, Frank graduated with distinction. He didn't chase mythology. He contributed to memory, one unhurried line at a time. So we close where we began. A record spins, light warms the boards, 2 hands meet and the floor decides to behave. Somewhere in the room, a boy measures his breath to the downbeat and becomes a man who can be trusted with tempo. The camera exhales. The song does what songs do. It ends, and then it echoes. If you were there, whether in Studio B or a living room 3 states away, you might still feel the echo if you stand very still. What did that music make of you? Do you have a photograph soft at the corners, a ticket stub, a pair of steps your body kept without asking? The floor is open. Tell us where the beat found you and what it helped you carry home.